He was the son of a World War I pilot. His earliest memories were the sounds of aircraft starting in early morning. 2 years before the United States entered World War II, he tried to enlist in the RAF, but at 17 was too young. A year later, he went to West Point, where he played football and made All-American. He was one of the most natural fighter pilots his instructors had ever seen. A kid who seemed to meld with his plane into a single being. On his first combat mission, he shot down 2 German fighters. By the end of the war, he destroyed 13 German planes in the air and 11 and a half more on the ground. He sat out Korea, but in Vietnam flew more than 150 combat missions. He was a hard-drinking, hard-cussing officer who didn't bother to hide his contempt for the limits politicians had placed on the war.
I think he ruffled feathers and made people very, very uncomfortable, because often what he was saying was absolutely true and it was going against what people were expecting him to say.
He was nonetheless so well respected by the Air Force brass, they made him Commandant of Cadets at the Air Force Academy, in hopes that he would pass his passion and tactical brilliance on to the next generation of Air Force officers. He is Brigadier General Robin Olds, and he is a legend of air power. Robin Olds was born in 1922 in Honolulu, Hawaii. His mother died when he was 4 years old, and his life was dominated by his father, Major General Robert Olds, himself a flyer and a confidant of Billy Mitchell.
Well, his father, General Robert Olds, was one of the pioneers in military aviation, and Robin grew up with that background. He grew up with people coming to his house every night or, on weekends that were the pioneers of aviation when military aviation was just starting. So he got indoctrinated pretty early.
He spent most of his youth living on base in Langley, Virginia. His father played a prominent role in convincing a skeptical bureaucracy that the country needed to spend more money on combat aircraft. Olds remembers the uproar among flyers when President Coolidge asked, in all seriousness, why the Army didn't simply buy one airplane and let the pilots take turns flying it. But mostly what Olds remembers is growing up among the camaraderie of those early aviators in a world that seemed to him to revolve entirely around airplanes.
When I was a little boy, the first noises were engines of airplanes warming up pre-dawn. And I could tell one engine from the other, even when I was 4 and 5 years old, to my dad's delight. And I'd sneak down to and watch the aviators, watch the pilots. And I remember once, years later, I ran into a fellow who had been a sergeant there at Langley, and he told me the story of going into a hangar once. There was one plane sitting in the hangar, and no one was around, but all the controls were moving. And he walked up to the airplane and looked in this open cockpit, and there I was, down in there. I was about 6 years old, working the controls for all I was worth.
While there was never any doubt that he'd end up a pilot, his father insisted he get a proper education. But when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, Olds showed up at the Canadian embassy and tried to enlist in the Royal Air Force.
They laughed at me. That we have to get permission, your parents' permission. So Dad had just moved to Washington. I went home, and he came home from work. He said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Dad, I want you to sign this piece of paper." Well, it took about a week to scrape him off the ceiling. And back in prep school I went. That was the end of that.
After graduating high school, Olds considered enlisting and trying to fight his way into the Air Corps. But the rules at the time made that route difficult. And, having watched reserve officers struggle to gain a regular Army commission, he opted instead for West Point. He had, he admits, a romanticized view of what his career would be like.
I'm going to go to West Point, and I'll have a regular commission, and I'll fly airplanes, and I won't have to work for a living. And so I went to West Point.
There, he says, he learned the most valuable lessons an officer can learn: to associate and trust the people around you, to take orders, and to ignore fun and games. He impressed his teachers with his drive and focus, which was also evident on the football field. He played tackle and in 1942 made the All-American team. By then, of course, football seemed an almost irrelevant diversion. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States was no longer dominated by pacifists who believed we could stay out of the war. Olds took his basic and advanced flight training at tiny Stewart Field, just north of West Point. From the first time he put his hands on the stick, he knew flying was exactly what he was meant to do.
You're the brains, you know, you're the blood. The aircraft are the muscles. And each explosion of a cylinder, each whirl of the prop, every movement of the aircraft translates itself into you through your body, and you react, or it reacts to you. You don't think, now I'm going to do this and pull back and go up there. You're there. You don't think about it. It's instinctive.
2 months before Olds graduated, his father died. Robert Olds was only 47 years old. The flyers he had grown up with were scattered around the world and could not attend the funeral. So Olds graduated from West Point an orphan. His family was the Air Corps his father had helped make, a force that had fought for its very existence while young Olds was growing up. It had flowered into a full-fledged strategic force, the only force in the early months of the war capable of striking significantly at the enemy. Olds learned to fly P-38s in Arizona and California. He and all his classmates were anxious to get overseas, to get into the battle and test themselves. But they were caught in what Olds refers to as a catch-22. The Army wanted the Academy graduates to go overseas as flight commanders, but didn't want to promote pilots to command who didn't have battle experience.
And once it really soaked in that we weren't going anywhere, my friend and I, Al Tucker, went down to the L.A. Fighter Wing headquarters, found a sergeant who said, "You guys really want to go to war?" I said, "Yep." He said, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "I want to go to England." He typed out, 20 minutes later we had orders. So the moral of that is, if you want to get something done in the service, go to the sergeants.
Olds and his partner were off to England and the war. It took them less than a week to get there. Olds had never been so excited about anything in his life. Lieutenant Robin Olds arrived in England with the 479th Fighter Group in May 1944. In only a few days, he strapped into his P-38 and flew off with his squadron for a mission over occupied France. And there, the squadron flew around in circles, not bothering to attack anyone.
And I'm sitting up there getting more angry, cussing in my oxygen mask, you know, looking down, there's a train, there's trucks over here, the airfield there. And all enemy targets. This is prior to D-Day. Hey, why don't we do something?
After a few up-and-down missions, Olds and his wingman cooked up a scheme to get themselves into combat. While flying over the French countryside, Olds radioed his commander that he saw a moving train and was going down after it. "Roger," came the reply over the radio, and down Olds went. He made 2 passes at the train before his squadron arrived to back him up. And as he was swinging around for a 3rd pass, when an angry voice on the radio ordered everyone back into position at a safe altitude. Back at the base, the major in command of the mission confronted Olds, wanting to know why he had disobeyed orders by attacking the train.
"Sir, I called you. I said, this is New Cross lead. This is Blue 3. I got a train at 7 o'clock. I'm going down. Will you cover me?" And you said, "Roger." He said, "I didn't say Roger." You know what that's called? Gotcha. Gotcha. It was my wingman, and we had set it up.
While the strafing run on the train might technically have counted as Olds' first combat, his first air-to-air engagement occurred a few days later. Assigned a night mission, though they were not equipped with night fighters, Olds ended up separated from his squadron. Rather than returning to base, he continued on with the mission, flying alone toward a bridge in eastern France. He found the bridge just as dawn broke over the continent and was on his way back to base when he spotted a couple of planes on the far horizon.
And don't ask me to explain, but you know immediately, enemy. Yeah, something tells you, enemy. 99.9% enemy. But that 1/10 of 1%, I cut them off through the field, came up underneath and behind, and there were 190s, two of them. So we went roundy round, and I shot them both down.
Because of a design flaw in the P-38 gun camera, Olds expected there wouldn't be definitive records that the dogfight had even taken place. He returned to base sure he was going to be in trouble for going on the mission alone, and decided not to even bring up the kills for fear that no one would believe him. Sure enough, as he climbed out of his plane, his commander was waiting for him on the ground. The commander was mad, but not very. A bomber flying high over the battle had reported the kills. On his next mission, his flight came upon a large group of German fighters bearing down on a group of American bombers.
So we pulled up behind them, and just as I was about to fire, both engines quit. Because in my excitement, I'd forgot to switch tank. I said, what the hell, I fired anyway. So I've always, all these years since then, laid claim to the fact that I'm the only fighter pilot in the history of aerial warfare that shot down an enemy aircraft while in the glide mode.
He got his engine started again and returned to battle. He got 2 more kills that day. In only 2 air-to-air engagements, Robin Olds had shot down 5 enemy aircraft. He was officially a fighter ace. He was quickly promoted, first to captain and then to major. By the end of the war, he was one of the most famous pilots in the world. A dashing hero with an outsized personality and a total of 24 and a half kills, 13 in the air, the remainder German aircraft on the ground. Not long after the war ended, Olds was summoned to Supreme Air Force headquarters in France. When he got there, he was shown into a room that was filling with what Olds refers to as a book of heroes of the war. Generals, Medal of Honor recipients, half the staff of the Supreme Allied Command. All were awaiting the arrival of their host, General Karl Tui Spatz. Spatz had been an old friend of Olds' father, a pioneer military aviator who had been in charge of American air operations in the European theater. When he walked into the room full of heroes, Spatz greeted Olds first. Before he spoke with anyone else, he ushered the 22-year-old major into a side room for a private chat about Olds' father and the young officer's career.
Gave me some advice for the future about me firsters, me tours, Deadwood, dedicated people, you know. Then he said, look, here's, and he pulled out a wad of francs. He said, here's about $500 I won off poker from those fellows out there at the other one. He said, my car is waiting for you out front. Go into Paris and get lost, which I did.
After the end of World War II, the Army Air Force took its rakish, heroic fighter ace and assigned him to coach football at West Point. Robin Olds reported as ordered, but wasn't happy with the assignment. Thankfully, it lasted only a few months, and then he was transferred to California to fly the Air Force's first combat jet, the P80 Shooting Star.
It was like flying a jet-powered glider. Wonderfully acrobatic and agile, you know. No nav equipment. I mean, everything was still dead reckoning, but fun.
Olds helped form the Air Force's first jet acrobatic team, a precursor of the Thunderbirds that toured around the country, building the profile of the Army Air Force in support of making it into a separate branch of the military. He was flying a performance in California when his wingman, Pappy Hearst, failed to pull out of a dive and crashed.
And I wanted to land way down at the end of the field, but they made me taxi right in. There was a little lump of people. They didn't know which one of us. They just knew one had crashed. And I had my visor down, my oxygen mask on. I didn't want to get out of that airplane because his wife was standing in that little crowd. But finally I put my head down, took my helmet off, and stood up and backed out. And I glanced over my shoulder. She was dead gone.
Olds reformed the group as a team of 4 and went on flying shows for the remainder of the air show season. He also planned a flight from California to Washington, D.C. for lunch and back in a single day. He and his wingman got lost in clouds over West Virginia. When it seemed like enough time had elapsed, they dipped out of the clouds to see where they were. They were right over the Washington Monument.
We hadn't asked anybody's permission to do this or told anyone that we were going to do it, but the press got hold of us, so they were flight following us by telephone, you know? And the Pentagon heard about it, and they were furious, but, you know, especially the information people, because they hadn't been cut in on it.
The publicity stunt worked. The idea of flying so fast that you could cross the continent, have lunch, and be home for dinner captured the public imagination. In 1947, the Congress voted to make the Air Force a separate branch of the service. Olds missed the Korean War. He had recently married Ella Raines, a movie actress, and was convinced that she or powerful studio people she worked for pulled strings to keep him out of combat. He revamped gunnery training for the fighter forces in Europe, but was angry that he missed the war and came back, he says, with a chip on his shoulder. Assigned to the Pentagon, he started fighting what was then the prevailing wisdom that in a nuclear age, fighters were irrelevant.
Well, my boss, a 2-star general in the basement of the Pentagon, called me in one day and said, Robin, or Colonel Olds, said, I'm sick and tired of these studies you're forwarding to me about our lack of tactical air capability. I want you to understand, Colonel, and get it through your head. We are never again going to fight a conventional war.
That was in 1962, just about the time the first American Army forces were deploying into Vietnam. In 1966, Olds, then 44 years old, was angling for a combat assignment when he got what might, in other circumstances, have been good news. He was on the list for promotion to general.
Now what am I going to do? I don't want to be a general, because the war was just heating up over there in Southeast Asia, and I missed Korea. I was damn well not going to miss this one.
Olds' only option was to find a way to get himself off the promotion list. To that end, he staged an impromptu, low-altitude aerobatic demonstration just outside of London. Sure enough, Olds' commander called him in.
He pulled out a piece of paper, waved it in my face, said, you can't see this, but that says you'll never be promoted. I think now we're getting somewhere. Then he waxed really furious and eloquent, and finally he shook his finger at me in utter rage. And he said, and you are the kind of Air Force officer that ought to be in Southeast Asia. And I jumped up and saluted him and said, thank you very much, sir, and walked out of the room. And he was still shouting at me.
Colonel Robin Olds, at the tender age of 44, was sent to command the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing based in Thailand. On the way over, he stopped off to see his old friend, fighter pilot Chappie James.
I overheard them talking, and he was offering my father a position in his wing in Thailand. He said, oh, really? You're going to Thailand? He says, yes, if you come over, you can be my operations guy. You can be the deputy commander for operations. And then when Colonel Garrison goes home, you can be the vice commander. What do you think about that? And he said, well, that's fine, but that wing is primarily a reconnaissance wing. He says, nope. He said, that's all going to change.
Olds arrived, and James wasn't far behind him. And the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing did indeed change.
He knew what he was getting into from his World War II experiences, and he knew the way the war was being fought in Vietnam, and he trained his people to fight that war, and he protected his people, which was a large part accounted for the success they had as a wing.
The two officers drilled their pilots in air-to-air tactics and demanded of them the same steely discipline they demanded of themselves.
And they became known as Black Man and Robin. And they shot down more MiGs in one day, more enemy aircraft in one day in the famous Operation Bolo MiG sweep, as they called it, than any other organization did.
Olds flew an incredible 152 combat missions in Vietnam. He shot down 4 North Vietnamese planes, bringing his lifetime total to 17.
I asked him once whether he really had the rumored 5th MiG. And his quote was, and this is a quote, "I choose not to answer that question." And the reason for that is that he had been told that when he got the 5th MiG, and it looked like he was going to, that when he got the 5th MiG, they were going to bring him home. And Robin Olds is a fighter pilot, and he wanted to stay with his wing. He wanted to stay in the war, in the fight. And there has always been a suspicion he may have gotten the 5th plane. Nobody really knows but him, I guess.
He came home disgusted with the failure of his government, but inspired by the accomplishments of his men.
They were proud of themselves. They had every right to be. We were doing what we were told, and we were doing it well. And we admired, respected, loved one another. It was a very tight, wonderful unit. Still is to this day. No, nobody feels sorry for himself.
Olds returned to the United States in 1967 and took over as Commandant of Cadets at the Air Force Academy. There he became a living symbol of the Air Force, a direct tie between its origins in World War I, where his father served, and the era of missiles and laser-guided munitions.
He did have a major impact on a whole generation of fighter pilots who met him at the academy. He inspired a lot of people who would later go on and fight in the Vietnam War.
I loved being in the Air Force. I loved the responsibilities that came my way. I met them head on with everything I possessed given to the jobs that I had. I wouldn't change that for anything.
If you could take the genes from the consummate military leader and combine them with the genes of the consummate fighter pilot, the result might look just like this. However, if you created a fictional military hero with Brigadier General Robin Olds' resume, an editor would likely reject it for being beyond believable. In 1942, Olds was an All-American tackle for West Point. In 1943, he was commissioned a second lieutenant and completed pilot training. He entered World War II flying a P-38 he named Scat-1. As he progressed through different iterations of fighter planes, he simply kept adding Roman numerals to the Scat name. He finished the war in a P-51 named Scat-7. In addition to becoming a double ace plus with 12 aerial victories, he destroyed another 11 1/2 aircraft on the ground. He later became the wingman on the Air Force's first aerobatic jet team. In 1966, he became commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, Thailand. Robin Olds flew 152 combat missions in Southeast Asia in F-4 Phantoms, 105 of them over North Vietnam. He shot down 2 North Vietnamese MiG-17s and 2 MiG-21s. Robin Olds was famous for something else. He never learned to mince words or play politics with the mission of the military, as those in the Warbirds in Review audience learned when Olds described his return from Vietnam.
I got home about the last day of September, 1st of October, on a Friday. My family in Washington, and I'm on leave. Phone rang Saturday. Said, "Get over here to the Pentagon. Chief of Staff wants to see you Monday morning." I said, "I'm on leave." He said, "Doesn't matter. The chief wants to see you." I said, "Yes, sir. Okay." I reported into his office. He's the one that walked up to me and said, "Take off that mustache." "Yes, sir." The next thing I knew, he briefed me, and I'm in the Oval Office of the White House. You know, God, me? LBJ was the president. So I'm sitting on the end of a couch, he's on an easy chair, and his aide, a colonel, Air Force colonel, was sitting on my right. And Mr. President said, welcome home, Colonel. You did well. Thank you very much, sir. Yeah, well, what's it like to be home? That was the weekend that thousands and thousands of hippies marched on the Pentagon. I said, sir, who are all those funny-looking people that marched on the Pentagon yesterday? And I'm going to quote for you folks. He said, I got 240,000 boys over there in Vietnam. When those boys come home, they'll tell the American public what's happening. And I thought, wait a minute. That's your job, not mine. Well, of course, you don't say that. So the best thing I could think of to come up with said, sir, I've been home since Friday. Been to a couple of dinner parties. No one asked me where I've been or what I've been doing for the past year. In case somebody does ask, what would you like me to tell them? I'm thinking, end of career. He glared at me and then he said, well, Colonel, you tell them, I'm quoting, that we are preventing the North Vietnamese from interfering in the democratic process in South Vietnam. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't say that. Well, why not, Colonel? Well, sir, if that's why we're there, I don't want to be the one that spreads the word. It was grim for a few minutes, but I hand the man full credit. He let me talk. He listened. And he sent me down the next morning to talk to his chief security advisor in the basement of the White House. We argued for a couple of hours. But this security advisor and I argued. At one point I said something. He said, we can't do that. That'll bring down the Chinese. I said, the Chinese and the North Vietnamese have hated each other for a couple of thousand years. They fought wars against each other. Haven't you read their history? No, he hadn't. So finally he said, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, for God's sakes, sir, mine the harbors, because everything they use came in by ship bottom. Gas, missiles, ammunition, everything, food. His response, when I said mine the harbors, was, we can't do that. That's an act of war. Now, mind you, this was about the 2nd or 3rd of October of 1967. I wonder if he ever wondered what the hell we were doing over there. Now, it was, I maintain we had every reason to be there, but we went about it improperly under the leadership of McNamara and Johnson.
Sadly, Robin Olds passed away on June 14, 2007.
Across the Black River, the Red River, down the mountain chains to your target. So for the pre-strike, we went up. I said, Orange 5-6, this is Lincoln lead, tally ho. And this guy said, Lincoln, take the perch. And I said, what? He said, take the perch. Let me tell you what that told me. It told me this was a new guy from the States, probably his first mission, obviously out of SAC, following the rules. And I said, son, we don't take a perch around here. Just hold still. We'll be right there. What I didn't tell him was when we came up behind the tanker, each of us in F4s are taking turns. It was unsafe, but we're making sure that the growl of the Sidewinder coincides with the sight picture, and the sight picture is his engines. He didn't know that. So we refueled, and everything's fine. Everything's fine. I stayed in a bit too long. Got in a fight with a bunch of MiGs, and I'm tapping the burners. Pretty soon I looked at the fuel gauge, and we are way below what we should have been. We had 3 bingos. Bingo. Hard bingo means you better get back to the, and then I can't say the word, but bingo. Which meant you better get to the tanker or you're in deep trouble. So I thought, Robin, you have really climbed deep in North 6. We never usually went out low. Fortunately, no SAMs. I called him, hey, Orange 5-6, head north. He says, Lincoln, I got to check with Brigham, ground. I said, Brigham is busy. Head north. I'll work the intercept, with the radar on the F4. Well, finally, here he came. And I'm looking at my fuel gauge, and it's like this. My other 3 guys were low, but I was the worst. So we got the tanker, I turned him, plugged in, I relief. They finished. Now I came up for my full offload. Plugged in, he pulled the boom and stowed it. This is one of those big tanker birds. And I said, hey, give me some fuel. This pilot said, no, we're bingo, RTB, meaning he was low on his fuel, returning to base, RTB. I said, wait a minute. I'm going to have to bail out of this airplane in just a minute or 2. Give me some fuel. No, we're bingo. And I said, I knew from reading his, method of operation, he could fly from where we were over northern Laos all the way to the south of Thailand, turn left, and go to the Pacific, go to the Philippines, and loiter for 20 minutes. That was his bingo. And my fuel gauge is like this. So finally I said, okay, I got 1 sidewinder left. I'm going to drop back about 2,000 feet, and before I pull the ejection handle, I'm going to pull the trigger, so put your parachutes on. Boy, that boom came down. I plugged in. He started fueling me. My left engine quit. That's how low I was. I managed to hang on and get it started. He said, how much do you want? I said, fill it up. Which I didn't want because couldn't land with that much fuel. So I did a dirty trick. Got my offload. I pulled right up in front of him about 1,000 feet and hit the jettison switch. And got rid of half of that fuel. I said, you might need it. I said, sir, the MiGs are getting awful frisky, as you know. I have an idea of something we can do about it. He just grunted, and I thought, oh, well, end of that. But 5 days later, I'm in his office. He said, okay, what's your idea? I said, sir, I want to plan a mission where I'll take my F4s up there and we look like 105s, because the MiGs love to tangle with the 105s. So we planned and planned and planned and planned, and pulled this mission off on the 2nd of January. Now the F4, if you may have noticed, not in afterburner, but in full mill, leaves smoke trails. One factor. 2, a friend of mine named Donovan F. Smith in 7th Air Force said, Robin, I'm going to send you QRC 190s. Like you, what the hell is that? It's an ECM pod, a jamming emitter against their SAM sites, which the 105s had carried, but we never had. So there's a bit of deception. And then Mother Nature got in the act. Morning. Morning. Mother Nature got in the act and gave us a nice undercast so they couldn't see the smoke trails. So we did all this stuff, went down right over Fujian, Nothing. Turned around just north of Hanoi, came back. My backseater says, I got one. Oops, went underneath. So I turned around and came back. Then here arrived my second flight. And the first transmission was, a lead, you got a MiG-21 on your ass. What a way to start a fight. But they all popped up through the clouds. They thought we were 105s, but we were loaded for bear. And we got 7 of them. Found out I heard a transmission of their radio chatter. The lead says, whatever the ground said, hey, these aren't 105s, these are Phantoms. What do we do? Well, there was great confusion. In the meantime, we're bang, bang, bang. That was fun. Yeah.
Another leading question, your interview with President Johnson. You're coming back to the States and
Do I have to? Do I have to?
No, sir, you don't have to.
Well, I will. We're talking about Vietnam, obviously. I got home about the last day of September, 1st of October, on a Friday. My family in Washington, and I'm on leave. Phone rang Saturday. Said, get over here to the Pentagon. Chief of Staff wants to see you Monday morning. I said, I'm on leave. He said, it doesn't matter, the chief wants to see you. I said, yes, sir, okay. I reported into his office. He's the one that walked up to me and said, take off that mustache. Yes, sir. The next thing I knew, he briefed me, and I'm in the Oval Office of the White House. You know, God, me? LBJ was the president. So I'm sitting on the end of a couch. He's on an easy chair, and his aide, a colonel, Air Force colonel, was sitting on my right. And Mr. President said, welcome home, Colonel. You did well. Thank you very much, sir. Yeah, well, what's it like to be home? That was the weekend that thousands and thousands of hippies marched on the Pentagon. Sir, and my daughter Chris had told me what hippies were. I said, sir, who are all those funny-looking people that marched on the Pentagon yesterday? And I'm going to quote for you folks. He said, I got 240,000 boys over there in Vietnam. When those boys come home, they'll tell the American public what's happening. And I thought, wait a minute. That's your job, not mine. Well, of course, you don't say that. So the best thing I could think of to come up with said, sir, I've been home since Friday. Been to a couple of dinner parties. No one asked me where I've been or what I've been doing for the past year. In case somebody does ask, what would you like me to tell them? I'm thinking, end of career. He glared at me, and then he said, well, Colonel, you tell them, I'm quoting, that we are preventing the North Vietnamese from interfering in the democratic process in South Vietnam. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't say that. Well, why not, Colonel? Well, sir, if that's why we're there, I don't want to be the one that spreads the word. Ooh. It was grim for a few minutes, but I hand the man full credit. He let me talk. He listened. And he sent me down the next morning to talk to his chief security advisor in the basement of the Pentagon, of the White House. And we argued for a couple of hours. How come he gets to fly it and I don't? But this security advisor and I argued. At one point I said something. He said, we can't do that. That'll bring down the Chinese. I said, the Chinese and the North Vietnamese have hated each other for a couple of thousand years. They fought wars against each other. Haven't you read their history? No, he hadn't. So finally he said, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, for God's sakes, sir, mine the harbors, because everything they used came in by ship bottom. Gas, you know, missiles, ammunition, everything, food. His response, when I said mine the harbors, was, we can't do that. That's an act of war. And mind you, this was about the 2nd or 3rd of October of 1967. I wonder if he ever wondered what the hell we were doing over there. Now, it was, I maintain we had every reason to be there, but we went about it improperly under the leadership of McNamara and Johnson.
Here and here.
Yeah.
Hi, continue.
This is Marius Maxwell, Dr. Marius Maxwell. This is his airplane. This is actually the first time he's seen it in this paint job. And
it's beautiful.
Good job, yeah.
It's absolutely beautiful. This is
you want to tell us a little bit about this particular airplane?
Oh, well, I really would just defer to Robin Olds. I agree with everything he says always. It's a lovely airplane, 1947 P-51, and it's Scat 6, now and henceforth, and that's about all there is to say.
All right, thank you. We'll open it up for questions. If do you have anything else you'd like to say before we open up for questions, General?
I think I've already said too much.
No, sir, you never say too much.
Anybody got a question? Yo.
Thank you. I may have missed it in the introduction. What was your involvement in Korea? Obviously, you were in World War II, got 13 kills, Nam, 4 more or more. What were you up to in Korea? Thank you.
I had a squadron of 86s. They're drawing pilots from us. My name headed every list. Turned down every time. I never knew why. I blamed a colonel that I worked for. Took me 20 years to find out. My wife then was doing a television show in New York City. I mean, she was an actress. Her mother. The backer was a very powerful, wealthy man whose friend was the Secretary of the Air Force. The backer told the Secretary, don't let him go. It took me 20 years to find that out. And I don't think you knew that, Chris. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Where? Somebody else of the P-38 pilot. They put aileron boost on the airplane later, but we never had it. But it would roll just as fast as you had to roll it under whatever circumstance. Matter of fact, I prided myself as being a pretty good P-38 pilot, and I could whip a P-51 down low. You know. Oh, a story about, this is kind of amusing to me. People often ask me, said, wasn't it wonderful to fly a P-38 with those 2 engines? And I said, boy, it sure was. I came home 5 times on single engine, all shot up. Love that bird. But you know the strangest thing? I flew another tour in P-51s. I came home single engine every day. Yeah.
General, you've had an incredible career flying a variety of different aircraft. What was your favorite aircraft that you flew over the years?
Well, I have to add the F-4, but the many years in between. I love that bird.
General Olds, just a quick question. In World War II, was your more feared adversary the 109 or the 190?
I didn't fear either one of them.
What was your preferred?
Don't get out in front of me. No, sir, I know you're asking a serious question, but, you know, in combat, you don't have time for that kind of analysis. You're fighting another human being, which you don't think about, another machine. And you try to anticipate what's he going to do next, which way is he going to go. So in a big fight, there's danger from being shot at There's danger from collisions, okay? Those are the two worst, as you know. You try to get your people to fight as a team, but it doesn't work. You're lucky if your wingman can hold on. It takes an extraordinary wingman to follow the violent maneuvers, and pretty soon you do get split up. And in World War II, we got split up almost every fight. You go home with one or two, or one. I never saw 110 or a 410 except on the ground.
Next question.
I'm very. When you're engaged, do you ever watch the controls of the other aircraft that you're engaged with? That's how dumb I am. Okay.
Answer, no. Technically, maybe too far away. But combat-wise, you're anticipating his move, depending upon your relative position. I mean, if he's behind you, you can't see. You don't want that. If he's out here in a turn, God, if he turns back that way and you're trying to turn inside him, if he goes like that, you got him. So then it's who can turn the tightest, okay? So you don't really think that way. You know what he has to do. Well, it's like one day going in, you mind if I make a story out of this?
No, sir.
I was commanding the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing in England. Been there a year and a half. Been a colonel for a long time. Phone rang. Somebody from Washington. Almost whispered, "You're on the list," meaning I was going to be a general. This was 65. I didn't want to be a general. I wanted to go to Southeast Asia. I missed Korea. I'm going to go to Southeast Asia. What can I do? I can't tell the Air Force I don't want to be a general. They'll say, okay, fine, get out. I know. I'm going to make that boss of mine so mad, he'll take me off the list. He'll want to court-martial me. Then I'll go to Southeast Asia. So I got 3 guys. We put on a formation acrobatic demonstration in F-101Cs. That's a single-seat bird. Sorry, excuse for wings. But I had done that sort of thing on the very first jet acrobatic team back in '46. I was wingman. So I kind of knew what I was doing. We put on a wonderful show. Bomb burst, the whole 9 yards. Well, my boss heard about it. I bet his missile badge burned him. So I was called down to London, chewed out, tore up my Legion of Merit. My effectiveness report was all wrong. He waved a piece of paper in my face and said, "And this says you'll never be a general." And I thought, oh, now we're getting somewhere. And he chewed and waggled his wattles at me. And finally, in the most disgusting voice, he said, "And you are the kind of Air Force officer that ought to be in Southeast Asia." And I jumped up out of the chair and said, "Yes, sir. Thank you very much, General." About face and left, and he's still shouting at me.
Got one more question over here, Robin.
Wait.
Oh, you're not done.
Told you it would be a long one. So we're going up the Gulf of Tonkin one day. I've got a backseater named Steve Croker. Turned inbound at Kep, headed for the Northeast Railroad. We got hit by about 16 MiGs. There were 8 of us. Roundy round, longest dogfight I was ever in. Got one early. Lead was doing figure 8s down. I could see him down below us. So I told everybody, get out, RTB, bingo. made a circle to see if my guys got out. Then I left, and I thought about that guy. I said, nope, going back in. Went back in about 25 feet, and there he is. Headed for his base, but there's a little range of hills. And I told the backseater, I said, Stevie, you watch him. He's got 3 choices. He can bail out, he can hit that ridge, or he can get over the ridge and give me some airspace and I'll get a Sidewinder. He chose the latter, Sidewinder, boom, down he went. I plugged into that tanker with 300 pounds of fuel left. Oh, now that was a disconnected story because I forgot why I was going to tell you about that goddamn general.
Sam, this gentleman's been patiently waiting over here, Sam, to your right.
Oh, okay.
First of all, I want to thank you for the service you give to our country. And I've always wondered about the 51 versus the ME-109. Could he outturn you, or could you outturn him in a dogfight?
Good. I hope you all heard the question. I wish I could answer that question. I honestly think it depended upon the pilot and the cockpit. The birds were fairly equal. It's
France? No. Was he? And then he died in France flying as a reconnaissance in 38.
Yeah. He worked for a friend of mine. I'm sorry, what was the question?
General, please finish the story about the goddamn general.
It was a couple of years after that encounter, and I'm now a commandant of cadets at the Air Force Academy with a baby star up here, one. And I'm talking to my old boss, 4-star General Spike Moolmeyer, who was 7th Air Force Commander in Saigon. Another friend, 3 stars, then he was then commanding a training command, George Simler. Both of those gentlemen, of course, had spent their time in Southeast Asia. So while we were talking, here came the general from London that had chewed me out, waddling across the floor. And I said, excuse me, sir. Now, I know that both of these gentlemen had read my derogatory file because it's rather thick and good reading. And excuse me, sir. Oh, General Hardy, how nice to see you again, sir. You remember that magnificent chewing out you gave me there in Ruislip back in 1965? Oh, yes, sir. These two, 4-star, 3-star, are kind of listening. I said, sir, you told me something that day that I've always wondered about. You said I was the kind of Air Force officer that ought to be in Southeast Asia. And I've wondered ever since, in your estimation, what kind of Air Force officer should not be in Southeast Asia. I thought Simler was going to fall on the floor laughing. And even Moolmeyer laughed, which I'd never heard before. And as General Hardy whirled about, red-faced, walked away, I reached between these two gentlemen and said, "Gotcha!"
All right, folks. Thank you for coming, and please stand up and give this true American hero a hand here.
I took a hit through the hinge on this door, and the door flew back like a flap. And I wonder, why won't the airplane go, you know? And I'm dragging this thing just like a big flap. I got as far as Brussels, landed, saw what was wrong, had to take the door off. The hydraulic jack was bent, so I took it off, found a fitting on a wrecked airplane, and put the hydraulic lines together like this. Yeah, now I'm just a pilot, okay? Filled it up with hydraulic fluid, took off, the gear handle wouldn't move. What I had done was but 1,200 PSI against each other. There wasn't much response when you tried to move something. I got back to base, my maintenance officer said, "What was your hydraulic pressure?" I said, he said, "Well, you do know where the gauge is, don't you?" He said, it's down there right between you on the lower panel. I said, "Oh, is that what that is?" Thank you all very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.